So hello everyone. On the lecture this morning, pre-recorded, we have Andreas Malm with us to talk about the latest book, his latest book, the Corona, Climate and Chronic Emergency. Without further ado, Andreas, take it away and we'll kick off.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm sorry I'm not able to be with you in person for various reasons. It happens less and less frequently that you meet people in person these days, as you know, because of this wonderful virus that we have running around the world. Well, what shall I say? Well, let me just explain that this book that I wrote was something I produced more or less in a haste in April when I was myself under lockdown in Neukölln in Berlin, in Germany. And it's an attempt to grapple with the roots of this disease in the relations between humans and the rest of nature, and the relation between this coronavirus or generally pandemics of this kind and global warming, and to draw some political implications out of this situation. So I guess that's very briefly what the book is about.
So that's a very modest presentation of a book that, although not very large, does sum up a lot of rather nasty predicament that we're in globally at the moment, and especially in the global north, and especially with decent enough focus on Europe, where most of us having this conversation hail from. What's up with the world today, Andreas? In the first chapter, we're launching straight into, it's not a normal crisis.
No, I mean, what you see in various, as you said, we're ourselves based in the global north, but I think to understand what's going on, you need to shift to the global south. So if you look at East Africa right now, for instance, they have a combination there of the pandemic and the worst locust outbreak in living memory, with locust swarms devouring crops and devastating floods. In Bangladesh, you've seen over the past months also extremely devastating floods, with up to a third of the country underwater and people being displaced by these ultra heavy monsoon rains. And at the same time, you have the pandemic. And this summer so far, I mean, we're in a heat wave in Europe right now, but this summer we haven't had as catastrophic conditions in Europe as we had back in 2018. So it's, in a sense, on the climate front in Europe, it's a little bit back to normal, because all the worst events have again shifted to places like Somalia, Yemen, and Bangladesh, where it's out of sight. But there you have this very intense concentration of the corona catastrophe in combination with impacts from the climate catastrophe. And yeah, the book starts off by just setting that scene of this combination of catastrophes, and then I try to disentangle how they're related to one another.
Rather than graphic determinism, the book does, on the whole, and in the opening chapter as well, set out a scene as to how this particular predicament is connected to the way Western civilization largely, or the Western powers largely, run the world. As in, it's not just a very bad year for East Africa. There is something systemic in how a tiny virus and a major change in climatic conditions bring about misery, threat, as well as perhaps potentials for change.
Yeah, so I mean, if you just go through the book, it has 3 chapters, and the first one is a comparison between the corona pandemic and political responses to it in March, April this year, and the climate crisis and the total absence of relevant political responses to it. And then the second chapter is more of a deeper delving into the political ecology of zoonotic spillover, that is those diseases that stem from wild animals and then make a leap across the species boundary and enter human bodies and circulate among humans, just as with this coronavirus. And then the third chapter is the political, the political implications of this. But if we go into the second chapter, so my argument there is that this disease that we've experienced over the past months is often viewed, well, in Sweden predominantly so, as a bolt out of the blue, like some random event, almost like a meteorite that has struck us. In itself, it just happened this way. And all debates are around how to deal with it, how to treat it as a symptom, how to survive, whether to lock our societies down or not, and things like that. But my argument then, of course, I'm not the first one to make this argument, nor am I the last. It's a common argument because it's based on so extensive science. We have a trend since 3-4 decades of a steady rise in the production of emerging infectious diseases, and these diseases tend to come from wildlife. And why does that happen? Well, it happens because you have naturally viruses circulating in populations of wild animals, and that's not a problem for humans as long as humans let those wild animals live where in their habitats. But what happens when humans go into those habitats and wreak havoc in them and break them up and disrupt them is that what's in there spill out into human populations. So the fundamental driver of this trend is the destruction of wild nature, to put it simply. There is a metaphor used by one of the authors on this, that if you knock down an old building, you will have a lot of dust flowing up from that building, and it's something like that happening when humans go in and destroy wild habitats, that the dust of those viruses come flowing towards us. And more specifically, more particularly, the key driver of the rise in zoonotic spillover is deforestation. When you and this is evidently mostly plays out in the tropics. That's where you have the largest biodiversity in the world, including biodiversity of pathogens. When you ram through tropical forests, you cut them up and build roads, and you start logging and clearing patches and establish plantations or pastures or whatever it is. You establish what's called in the scientific literature interfaces. That is, you get in contact with what's in those tropical rainforests, including the pathogens and those species that carry them. So deforestation, and there's no question about this in the science. Instead, it's confirmed again and again. And there was a new paper just out the other day, I think, in Nature, that studies this on a very broad scale that I haven't had time to read. But there's no doubt that deforestation is the main and most destructive driver in the rise of zoonotic spillover in the tropics. That's in Latin America, in sub-Saharan Africa, and not the least in Southeast Asia. And more specifically, again, bats are the order of mammals that carry by far the most coronaviruses, if not practically all of them. It's quite likely that, or almost certain, as I understand it, that this particular coronavirus originated in bats. Bats being the natural host of this kind of virus. And when you cut down forests where bats live, those bats go somewhere else. They go into the plantations that you build, such as palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia. And then they become, their life cycles become encroached upon, and they become stressed and tend to shed the viruses that they have. Now, this is like the main driver of this trend, but you have others as well. One very important one being wildlife trafficking, or the trade in wild animals, which is one of the causes of the ongoing sixth mass extinction, that predominantly rich people purchase wild animals to eat or used for various types of luxury. And this, of course, is what appears to have happened in China with those wet markets, including the one in Wuhan, where this actual virus originated. So in this second chapter, I go into a little bit of detail around the political ecology of those drivers of zoonotic spillover and how they play out and how we should understand.
And there's a decent section on bats, as you've mentioned, and I've never been particularly afraid of bats, as some people are, and I'm very confident that their sonars are so precise that they will never run into me, as sometimes people are afraid at dusk. However, having read the section on bats a few weeks back, I was going to dinner with friends, and one flew kind of very close to my head, and I remember thinking, I really hope you're not stressed, dude. Because in the book, it's the stress on the bats that drives a lot of their spitting and pooing onto other animals. However, all this destruction of nature, as you say, it doesn't come from the quirk of the Indonesians or Indians or Vietnamese to have a particular penchant for cutting down forests. This is part of a larger political ecological explanation or process that we can read from political ecology perspective that connects to us here and our easily spreadable butters with the morning breakfast.
Yeah, so if you start to dig into the next question, then what in turn drives deforestation, if we put wildlife trading to the side for the moment, then it's becoming clearer and clearer that deforestation in the tropics is very largely driven by consumption in the north, in the global north. So deforestation nowadays is primarily caused by the expansion of commodity frontiers. So you cut down forests, tropical rainforests, to make room for the production of certain commodities, primarily beef, soy, palm oil, but then also things like coffee and chocolate, and other commodities of this kind. And these commodities might be grown in Malaysia, Indonesia, Brazil, Equatorial Guinea, or other parts of West Africa, but they are largely consumed in the global north. So you're right. Deforestation is not locally driven. It's part of a global economic system where very much of the deforestation happens to clear the space, practically speaking, for northern consumption. And that means that one of the political implications of this is that if our governments were interested in actually trying to prevent more pandemics from breaking out, they would try to rein in the consumption of goods from the tropics to begin with. you know, some obvious first steps would be things like banning the import of meat from the tropics. I mean, we can't justify importing meat from the Amazon to Europe, for instance.
And yet, as far as I understand, this is not a question of us changing consumer habits, having listened to this lecture or having read the book. This is a more systemic issue.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, if you look at palm oil, for instance, which is incredibly destructive to wild nature in Southeast Asia, most of the palm oil goes into industrial processes. So even if we as individual consumers had alternatives to palm oil in some products and could choose products that are free from palm oil, we still would only be able to you know, contact a tiny little fraction of the whole palm oil consumption that goes on in the global north, because it's packed into and hidden in industrial processes that we as individual consumers have no way to reach into. So if we would like to address these consumption patterns and these resource flows, individual consumers could only go so far, and it would have to happen on a society-wide level. That is, states would need to do it.
So is that something along the lines of a degrowth philosophy? And by degrowth, I don't mean these personal consumption choices or personal austerity, but societal change for ecological stability and social justice.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I think it aligns with much of the degrowth agenda and the insistence on tackling overconsumption in the global north and reduce certain types of biophysical resource flows. The reason I'm not framing it in degrowth terms in this book is that to me, the important thing is not whether you have at this stage, whether you have aggregate growth or not. It's about some things need to be terminated and other things need to replace them. And this goes for the climate issue as well.
And we're going to have to organize around that. And we keep repeating that degrowth is only a provocative term to kickstart a discussion rather than focus on specifically countable things that have to be reduced step by step. However, before moving on to solutions, which some might consider radical, and I certainly would like to hear more about the proposed solutions in the third chapter, there is this other horrific thing happening at the same time. We read about this particular zoonotic spillover daily because we count cases, we worry whether the academy is not going to happen or not. However, there is another horrific trend, again, connected systemically to the way we use nature and the way we then distribute what we've appropriated from there.
And what are you thinking of?
Climate.
Yeah, what's there to say about it? Yeah, I mean, what aspect do you have in mind?
Well, in the book, we have specifically a contrast between the response to the corona situation, to the pandemic, and a particular decadal long response or lack of, or the pretended response to the climate trend of change. Could we elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, when governments in Europe more or less shut down their entire economies back in March this year, starting in Italy and then very quickly spreading to other parts of Europe, this came, you know, on the heels of 2019, when the climate issue was on the top of the political agenda in Europe, and you had the climate movement reaching its peak of popular support and mobilization in the streets so far. All of that was just instantly punctured and terminated by the pandemic. But in March, And April, you had, because these two events were so close in time, you inevitably had the discussion about, okay, why can our governments act so rapidly and seemingly radically about the pandemic when they still haven't done anything about climate? And you know, the question became even more relevant when you saw governments doing precisely some of the things that the climate movement has asked for, such as encouraging the conversion of production from cars, for instance, to ventilators and other things needed in the healthcare emergency, precisely as the climate movement has long advocated that we should do a similar conversion from cars to wind turbines or other things needed in the transition. That never happened, but then this happened. So what's the difference? And I go through some of the various explanations for this difference, and yeah, there are many. I won't go into them here, but instead I'll make the point that I make towards the end, and that is that if you look at this event, this coronavirus pandemic, as fundamentally driven by the ecological crisis, then it's actually not all that different to the response to the climate crisis. Because what you have during the past half year is an attempt to treat the symptoms. So no one, except for whatever comes out of the ban on wildlife consumption in China and some of its neighboring countries, apart from that, no government has tried to go to the root of the problem and say we have to avoid more pandemics of this kind by changing our ways of exploiting nature. Instead, you have you have testing, you have projects to get a vaccine out there. You have various regulations to try to lower infection rates and things like that. This is in the nature of firefighting, or of coming to, trying to adapt to and survive a crisis without addressing its sources. And of course, you see the same kind of action, or pseudo action, if you like, on the climate front. So when this year started with the tail end of the wildfire catastrophe in Australia, you had parts of the Australian state apparatus declaring states of emergency and using the army to evacuate people from beaches and things like that. Again, you've had over the past months extreme torrential rains and floodings in parts of China, and you've had announcements of emergencies and the military going in to try to help people. This is the same kind of political response as we've had in the pandemic. So dealing with the symptoms without ever going for the drivers. And in that sense, advanced capitalist states and states like China as well have shown themselves capable of dealing with symptoms, but so far never fundamentally addressing the drivers either of zoonotic spillover or of global heating. So in that sense, the policy responses to the two have been quite similar so far.
So one slower, one faster, but basically just treating the symptoms.
Yeah.
So what do we do?
Yeah, the task for us, I believe, and it follows logically from this whole argument, is to try to turn those moments of crisis into political crisis for the drivers. Now, we saw some steps in that direction after the catastrophic heat waves in Europe of 2018, that gave birth to the Fridays for Future movement and Greta Thunberg and the school strikes, as well as Extinction Rebellion. and breathed even more life into the climate camp movement in Europe, hence the peak in climate mobilization that you saw in 2019, which came out of the summer of 2018, really, in Europe. So, I mean, the climate movement was what had some first initial tentative success in turning the crisis of symptoms in 2018 with the wildfires and droughts and everything into, in 2019, a political crisis, in the sense that we managed to push the climate issue to the top of the agenda, and it really colored a lot of the political life in a country like Germany, for instance, which is absolutely central to what's happening in Europe on these issues. Now, then the curtain went down with the pandemic, and so far, ecological movements, the climate movement and its allies, have not managed at all, I think, to transform this coronavirus pandemic into a period of ideologically and materially challenging and confronting the processes and interests that drive a disaster like this. But that should be, I mean, that should be our task when we face new climate disasters. I mean, we have a heat wave right now that's again very destructive in parts of Europe, although not as much as in 2018. But as we all know, it's just a question of time before we again are hit by by catastrophic climate impacts. The climate movement should try to be able to turn major climate catastrophes in the global south into issues for us in the global north as well. So I mean, it shouldn't be that climate is an issue in Europe only when Europe burns. I mean, if East Africa is underwater or Bangladesh is underwater, then that's pretty good reason to act in Europe as well. Probably a stronger reason to act. But in the coming years, when we have new climate disasters, and if or when we have new pandemics, and the science is quite clear on the projection that more pandemics of this sort will happen because the drivers are just continuing, then our strategic task really should be to try to turn those moments into crises for the drivers. Because if we don't, then we'll just have more of this, more pandemics and more climate disasters until the end of our days, basically.
And this is a question where perhaps the environmental concern joins up with a social justice concern, because under these conditions of both climate change and the pandemic, we have some people within societies, even in Europe, being affected more through the way they work, through the risks they take, and then through the both the infection and death rate coming from the pandemic, more so than some others. And understanding that as another driver for asking for systemic change is perhaps crucial to political action. Now, we usually are treated as somewhat young and tender children when invited to this political action, and we are usually told that if we give up on our palm oil breakfast as a bitter pill of horrible discomfort, then there will be a lot, there's a lot more to be gained, you know, kind of swallow this pill and then there'll be a toy coming up. And this toy is usually sold luxury solar communism, where we live happily with each other in great equality and things run on automate. In fact, from your historical perspective, we have a rather more exciting, sexier, perhaps, but also a bit grimmer picture as to what the struggle is like.
You froze there for a moment, so I might have lost parts of your questions. But you have the question of war communism in mind, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So the subtitle to this book is "War Communism in the 21st Century," and my discussion of war communism comes out of a very common discussion in climate circles, which is that the comparison between what needs to be done about climate and mobilization during the Second World War. So you often hear that we should treat the climate emergency as the Allies treated, or the US more particularly, the threat of Nazi world takeover, an existential threat that we have to combat with all resources at our disposal, just as the US state did following Pearl Harbor. And this war analogy has popped up a lot during the pandemic as well. Particularly at the start of it, there was a war rhetoric completely suffusing the situation, with everyone from Macron to Donald Trump saying we're at war with the virus. And there were parallels with the Second World War when, for instance, American auto factories started to convert their production, as I mentioned previously. Now, the analogy with the Second World War is often apt, but it has certain weaknesses. One of them being that dominant classes in the US were fully on board with that mobilization, even though they were perhaps a little bit inconvenienced by the level of state control for a while, but it didn't in any way threaten their interests. And more concretely, you can complain that the Second World War analogy is faulty, because what the American state did was actually to massively expand fossil fuel production and consumption through the war effort, and use the war to establish firm control over oil reserves in the Middle East and things like that. So if you want to be a little bit petty about it, there's nothing inspiring about the Second World War, since the whole war effort rose on a wave of oil and coal consumption. So yeah, rightfully it has pointed out that the analogy is not perfect. Now, one alternative analogy is to war communism, and I'm not pretending that this is a perfect analogy in all respects, but it contains some elements that are lacking from this the Second World War analogy. And war communism was a situation developing in Russia after the October Revolution, when you had a civil war of the fully globalized kind, where more than a dozen nations intervened to try to topple Soviet rule, in conjunction with all those counter-revolutionary armies from all corners, from the north, from the south, from the west, from the east, in combination with famine-like conditions and pandemics, the Spanish flu and horrific typhus and other disease outbreaks, smallpox and whatnot. So war communism was an attempt to survive in a chronic emergency, in an ever-deepening emergency, which is quite different from what you did in the US between 1941 and 1945. But it's a situation that's more similar to what we're facing right now, with all of these catastrophes gathering forces and attacking us from all directions, or so it seems. And war communism clearly was a struggle against the dominant classes of old Tsarist Russia, and those classes were vanquished. War communism also was, ironically, an effort completely deprived of fossil fuels. And this was not because Lenin and Trotsky didn't like fossil fuels. They loved fossil fuels, or they wanted as much of them as possible, coal and oil, but they were deprived of them by their enemies. So they lost virtually all oil and coal resources and had to build an entire army, the Red Army, on the basis of biofuels, what we would today call biofuels. So they had to chop down wood to drive their locomotives and all. And that's just, I mean, it's not maybe substantially significant, but it's somewhat interesting that this civil war was actually won by an army without any fossil fuels, fighting more than a dozen armies that had the access to all the fossil fuels in the world. So in that particular sense, it's a little bit more inspiring because, yeah, I mean, what the Bolsheviks and their allies had to do was to learn to live without fossil fuels from literally from 1 year to the next. And that's something that we need to learn to do as well. We shouldn't use the same methods as they did. These are metaphors, these are analogies. And someone who suggests that we use the Second World War as a model for climate mobilization is not thereby advocating that we drop more atomic bombs on Japan. And likewise, I'm not advocating the militarization of labor or armed food detachment going into the countryside or other things that happened during the Russian Civil War. This is just the point with these analogies is to try to think out what is ahead of us and what do we need to do. And maybe the most important thing here is that any radical solution to these crises, we know that, entails confrontation with very powerful material interests in the dominant classes. I mean, there's no sign that ExxonMobil will cease to exist as an oil and gas company of its own volition, or that any other oil and gas corporations voluntarily go out of business. Likewise, we shouldn't think that the large meat corporations in the Amazon will just one day realize the destruction they're doing and go home and let their pastures be rewilded. That's not going to happen. If it's ever going to happen, it's going to happen by these actors being compelled to do what's necessary. And that entails a moment of antagonism that was not present in in US wartime mobilization. And the difference here is also that those corporations, those business models will have to be done away with forever. I mean, ExxonMobil and companies of that kind will have to cease to exist permanently because fossil fuels will have to be left under the ground. So this shift that we need to make is a transition, and it's a transitional period, but it has to transform our economies practically forever.
And to stay with the metaphor for another minute, though, there were liberties. So from the perspective of you and me sitting in Europe with relative abundance, material abundance still, and with time to engage in conversation like this, it might seem that any kind of war metaphors are terribly frightening. There is destruction, etc. But yet there are examples in the war communism metaphor, again, not a guideline, of expansion of liberties and of different social organization and of greater happiness in the adversity, rather than simply a bitter pill with no honey spoon.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you look at it historically, unfortunately, war communism came with quite massive restrictions in people's liberties. So, I mean, war communism was a period of quite rapid degeneration of the democratic October Revolution. But what we need to do now is compatible with improvements in people's lives and increased liberty. And on several different levels. I mean, if you look at this pandemic, and if you're like me, not very happy about the whole lockdown thing and think it's quite suffocating to live under lockdown, there are a couple of points to be made. One is that a transition away from fossil fuels would not need to imply these massive restrictions in people's liberties that we've had in Europe and elsewhere during the past half year. So a shift away from fossil fuels would not at all benefit from people just sitting at home and I don't know, playing video games or whatever people do when they're at home. But you know, communal, convivial life, street parties or whatever might very well be part of a shift to another way of living with less fossil fuels, or with no fossil fuels, to be exact. You know, crowding and meeting a lot of people, hanging out in large social groups, that's exactly what has been banned during the pandemic. But in a shift away from fossil fuels, this would be perfectly fine and probably conducive to that shift. At the same time, we should keep in mind that if we don't do anything about the drivers of zoonotic spillover, including climate change as such, and we haven't spoken about this, but climate change as such increases the risk of more pandemics. Now, if we don't do anything about the drivers, we'll have more pandemics, which might well entail more lockdowns and more restrictions of people's liberties of this kind. So if we want to avoid such a situation where we're forced to live as hermits for the rest of our lives, or at least for recurring periods, and our kids cannot go out and things like that, we need to address the sources to make sure that this doesn't happen again and again and again and again and again. So it would be a liberating exercise, a project of emancipation from the terror of having to live under lockdown. And yeah.
Well, I feel we've only just warmed up and we have to start wrapping up. I really wish you could join us for a wine-addled seminar on Vis Island, because
yes,
I think our audience now will have more questions. But two brief remarks to start wrapping up. In the war metaphor, obviously it can be used polycentrically. So are there things we can learn from other struggles for liberation and emancipation, like the struggles in the European periphery, Greek partisans, Yugoslav partisans, as also societies rearranging themselves in the crisis conditions?
Yeah, certainly. Let me just say that the whole war metaphor is, I mean, you are right that it's frightening and it's problematic to frame everything as wars. What you see happening is that when disasters strike, as they do more and more, people take to war metaphors as a way to make sense of what's going on, and as a way of depicting the existential stakes or the magnitude of the crisis. And I think, I mean, there's little you can do about that. In a sense, it's maybe not natural, but it's a reasonable reaction to those disasters that you grasp for war metaphors. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made a very valid point towards the end of the Australian wildfire crisis, when the war metaphors reached new heights in Australia, that either we are in these war situations practically forever, or we try to shift our wartime mobilization mentality and metaphors towards the causes of the problem. So it's not like the existential crisis will go away and we can just wish that we live in peaceful conditions without disaster. Now, is there more to learn from other cases? Yeah, clearly. And you're absolutely right about the Greek and Yugoslav partisans. I have to say that I don't know the history in any detail, but a very important point is that during periods of social breakdown and catastrophe, such as Nazi invasion and occupation, you have popular forces coming to the surface that first want to survive, first of all, but the struggle for survival entails changing societies and moving in radically different directions. And this is what the partisans in Eastern Europe really tried to do. And you can, yeah, there are lots of examples from the end of the Second World War and from other periods in history where catastrophic conditions have triggered people not only aiding each other in the struggle to survive, but also because what catastrophes do is really they lift the veil on the status quo and show how catastrophic a form of society can be, and capitalism has proven perhaps to be the most catastrophic mode of production in history, because it throws one catastrophe after another against humanity. And these catastrophes are now in our century. They look very different from the First and the Second World War, but they're perhaps even deeper in that these catastrophes are playing out at the most basic levels of human existence, namely non-human nature, what we all rest on ultimately. This is where our catastrophes are playing out, whether it be global heating or global sickening or the rise in pandemics. And these catastrophes are likely to again set off popular initiatives to survive and change social conditions. And yes, you're right, we have a lot to learn from other episodes in history. It's not, we don't need to have a hang up on war communism and what happened in Soviet Russia and those.
And yet, before we perhaps as a whole society realize the extent of the crisis and the need for a dramatic change, there is also a lapse anarchist in the book saying there is a role for the state and for representative democracy in all this. There is a job to be taken over the state as it is, rather than throw it away and retire into our neo-rural communities of friends with small footprints.
Exactly. You nailed it there.
Okay, well, that as a shorter question. Andreas, thank you very much. I really wish you were with us on the island. We will now attempt to hold a live discussion, our connection permitting. But for now, thank you so much, and see you on this.
Yes, thank you.